Thank you again for joining us this evening for How the Tudor Revival Reinvented Christmas. Now, our speaker tonight is Dr. Daniel Gifford. He is a PhD. He's a public historian who focuses on American popular and visual culture, as well as museums and their role in American culture. He currently serves on the Filson's board of directors, and his career spans both academia and public history, including several years with the Smithsonian Institution. I'll return to moderate questions after Dan has finished his presentation as time permits. We'll have a hard stop at 7 p.m. If you have questions, I'll move this mic over and you can come up to the mic and ask them. And if you're joining us virtually, then by all means, enter your question in the chat room, and a member of our staff will have those available and we can ask those as well, again, time permitting. So, Dr. Dan Gifford, we're so glad to have you. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming out on a kind of misty, yucky evening. It's great to see everyone here. I want to kind of accomplish two things tonight. One is to sort of situate this idea of Tudor Revival as it relates to the holidays, as it relates to Christmas, specifically with our new exhibit, Olde England on the Ohio, Louisville's Tudor Revival. Did folks get a chance to see that a little bit beforehand? If not, I'm going to talk a little bit about the exhibit so that we can sort of situate this particular, call it deep dive, within the context of the exhibit itself. But if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, it's here through March 3rd. So you got plenty of time. And even if you've seen it, maybe I'll inspire you to come back and see some things that you may have missed the first time around. So that's goal number one. Goal number two is to sort of look at the holiday environment that we build around ourselves every year. You know, every year around this time, we start building up Christmas stuff. And a lot of that stuff has an architectural component. If you look at holiday villages, Santa's workshop, if you look at the sets of movies, if you look at Christmas parades, illustrations, advent calendars, you know, all of these things have a certain architectural element, an architectural style that we maybe don't think about that often. But what I want to do today is think about it a lot. So think about it for the next hour or so and sort of give a historical context to this world that we live in today, that we invent, you know, every year. You know, fads come and go, but there's a certain sort of set of iconography that keeps reappearing. And I think there's a reason for that. And even if it's not architecture, there is this sort of, you know, medieval Merrie Olde England element that permeates a lot of holiday culture and a lot of visual culture around the holidays. And that's very much part of this as well. So to talk a little bit about the exhibit itself. This is sort of I call it my elevator speech version of the exhibit. You know, what is this exhibit ultimately about? It's about how and why Louisville and the rest of the nation fell in love with a mythic Merrie Olde England in the early 20th century. And in doing that, you know, one thing that we've sort of done with this exhibit that maybe, I wouldn't say radical, but maybe a little surprising, is we've taken this idea of Tudor Revival, which is very much rooted in architecture. You know, it's very much an architectural term, and we've sort of expanded it beyond architecture into a whole range of cultural manifestations, you know, beyond just, you know, the buildings and the half timber and the, you know, the elements that we recognize, you know, as an architectural style, and really sort of expand that into a host of manifestations, including the holidays, including what we're going to be talking about tonight. And one, I think, graphic that's in the exhibit that's probably one of my favorite graphics in the exhibit is this chart that I think explains why we've done that. This is a chart of the phrase "Ye Olde." And if you think about Ye Olde, It has never had more prominence and more use in our vernacular than in the 20s and 30s, the years of Tudor Revival. And that's not by accident. The two are symbiotic. They go with each other. What we think of as an architectural style has all these other manifestations as well that permeates in this sort of Ye Olde vision of, as I said, a mythic Merrie Olde England. Now, the exhibit itself is sort of divided into 6 sections. There's a sort of traditional introduction. There's the section that I say most people probably expect when they come to something called a Tudor Revival exhibit, which is, you know, a long wall of some of the most iconic structures in Louisville. And then there's a little section, pair of sections called exclusion and laying claim. I'm going to come back to those in just a second. And then we move into popular culture, and then a sort of finale conclusion looking at the end of Tudor Revival. And that's sort of a, you know, a nice overview of the exhibit and the flow of it. Within that, we do try to make sure that everyone knows what Tudor Revival is, what we're talking about. One of my favorite graphics in the exhibit is this wonderful piece that was designed here at the Philson by Brooks Vessels that does a nice job of sort of emphasizing what the elements of Tudor Revival are. So you have, you know, these steep gables and roof lines. One of my colleagues said, you know, well, Tudor Revival is easy. It's the one with the triangles. And she's right. Absolutely. It's just, you know, when you spot these triangles, you know you're looking at Tudor. Probably the most iconic, the most recognizable is this half timbering. The chimneys are always very prominent, but a few things that people tend to forget about: mixed materials. You know, the use of brick and stone and half timbering and stucco, and all of it in a very asymmetrical way. You know, Tudor Revival rarely is going to be symmetrical on each side. It's very much an asymmetrical design. Medieval flourishes. You know, this really gets into what we're talking about tonight, the idea of towers and turrets and coats of arms and references to knights and, you know, all these other elements that harken back to, again, a sort of mythic Merrie Olde England. And then someone. Doors and windows we tend to forget about, but you know, very important in Tudor Revival architecture. These sort of dramatic doors, the sort of classic Tudor arch, this not quite Gothic arch, leaded glass windows, stained glass, and even you can kind of see it here, bottle bottom. So all, you know, very dramatic, all very evocative of trying to capture a particular mood. I said I'd come back to those 2 sections about exclusion and laying claim. And we can't look at this architecture that harkens back to a mythic Anglo-Saxon history without thinking about what else is going on in the 1920s and 30s. You have a very dynamic, very divisive conversation about immigration that's continuing even after quotas have gone up. You have the great migration of African Americans coming from the South into northern cities. And you have the continued sort of hardening of Jim Crow, which very much affects homes, houses, buildings, architecture as well. And so, you know, there is a very definitive stream of literature, of writing from elites, from commentariat, from architects, from designers, from academics, you know, a sort of upper echelon that want to make Tudor Revival very much about heritage, about breeding, about parentage, about lineage. And, you know, the great thing as a curator is I don't really have to like do any gymnastics, interpretive gymnastics to sort of get at this. It's pretty explicit. And in the exhibit, I think there's a very, I hope, powerful section where these scroll by on the wall. They're projected on the wall, and you can see, you know, how these words like, you know, Anglo-Saxon and breeding and race and heritage actually play out when people are talking about this style. Now, I always say if that's where the story ended, I probably wouldn't have done this exhibit, you know, because it's, yeah, kind of a shame and kind of boring. But the great thing, and the reason I did do this exhibit, is they totally failed. This very sort of top-down elitist view of what Tudor Revival should be. When you look at Louisville, especially as a microcosm, if you look at this as sort of a case study for this larger phenomenon, you see how wrong and how hopeless this was. That people of all stripes, all colors, all backgrounds took Tudor Revival and made it their own. And so this exhibit looks at that in Louisville. One of our best architects, much less African-American architect, Samuel Plato, in Louisville, when it came time for his most important job, his most important commission, the family home. What did he build for his wife and his children? He built a Tudor Revival. What did Ben Snyder, the famous department store, entrepreneur, a Russian immigrant, a Jewish immigrant who's about as far from Anglo-Saxon heritage as you can get, what did he do? He built a Tudor home. And so on and so on. We see example after example of working class, low income, African Americans, all these different groups that, right, well, I don't care what you think Tudor Revival is. This is what it is to me. And that's where it gets really interesting. And it also then sort of opens the door to why we look at popular culture. Once you sort of recognize those boundaries falling, those sort of walls falling down, if they ever were, really, that strong in the first place, then you can see how Tudor Revival sort of permeates all of popular culture. And we look at three examples: holidays, bourbon labels, of course, and silent movies. And in doing that, what we really say is this exhibit considers Tudor Revival as a broad cultural moment decided from the ground up, not the top down. Okay, so that's a little bit about the exhibit. And here in this last slide, you can see where I've sort of slipped Christmas into this larger narrative, this larger exhibit, this larger piece of history that we're trying to tell here at the Philson. What I want to do now is take that little piece and go deep, much deeper than we could do in the exhibit. And really sort of explore this question of the holidays and Tudor Revival, all of these manifestations, all of these ways that we can see Tudor Revival manifesting itself in this larger cultural moment of the 20s and the 30s. So what I'm going to do is go through several examples, several genres, greeting cards and postcards, illustrations, department stores, larger sort of retail environment, Christmas seals, which I'll explain why, as well as animation. I'm going to occasionally take sips of water, just so I don't have a coughing fit. All right, so before the era that we're talking about, before we get into the 20s and 30s, there's sort of two distinct waves that feed into what we consider today, what we recognize today as the Christmas iconography, the Christmas scenes that we see, each year. The first is the German influence. The German influence, Christmas trees, of course, come from this. You have, lots of sort of our carols and songs, all sort of emerging from a German folk heritage. And then very much the Victorian, the Dickensian, that classic you can never get away from, Dickens, A Christmas Carol. And, that has a huge influence on Christmas as well, and an iconography that's still with us today. What I want to do is introduce a third wave. And the third wave, of course, is Tudor Revival, is this iconography that emerges from a sort of imagined idea of what a medieval Merrie Olde England must have been like. So I said I'd start with cards, and I'm actually starting with postcards as opposed to traditional Christmas cards, because postcards were actually a huge phenomenon in the early 20th century. And these are actually a little early, kind of harbingers almost of what is coming. The Tudor Revival is really a fad of the 20s and 30s, early 30s at least. These are earlier than that, 16 and 15. But you can see right away what we're talking about. You can see right away that sort of Merrie Olde England, that sort of medieval look and feel, broadly interpreted. Lots of liberties are taking place here. And this is one thing that I think we emphasize in the exhibit is this was never about historical accuracy. This was never about getting it right. This was about being inspired. This was about him being delighted. This was about play and joy and things that made people smile. And so there's this, very much a reinterpreted Merrie Olde England. If there are any medievalists in here, I just encourage you to go ahead and just shut your eyes for the rest of the exhibit. Because this isn't accurate. This isn't what it was really like. It's a mythology that built up. It also, again, has a context. I talked about a German wave, that first German wave. It's important to remember that the dates we're looking at have a context. World War I. People are not huge fans of things German right about now. And so there is a bit of a turning away and a looking for alternatives to a German Christmas, a German heritage. Well, what could that be? How about English? How about French? And once you start doing that, you sort of naturally fall into, these sort of medieval-y themes, especially in wartime of, knighthood and valor and honor and chivalry and all the rest, as you can see here. And so one of the things that we talk about in the exhibit is that even the term Tudor Revival really isn't even used that often in this period. It's a hodgepodge. It's an amalgamation of Tudor and Gothic and medieval and English and Norman and Old World and so on. This is one of the houses in Normandy Village. If you've ever seen Normandy Village over in the Douglas Highlands area, National Park Service thinks it might be Louisville's first cul-de-sac. We look at this and we have no doubt that this is a Tudor Revival house. But at the time, it actually wasn't marketed as a Tudor. It was marketed as a Norman. It's Normandy Village. It meant the same thing. It meant this sort of hearkening back to an Ye Olde, that term Ye Olde. But lots of these terms get thrown around. And so with that as context, what you start to see is this huge outpouring of imagery around Christmas and around the holidays through the mail of a mythic Merrie Olde England. And just, a nice collection up here. And so as we were creating the exhibit, one of the things that we were looking for was something within the Filson collection that tied all this together. And we found it in this collection of Christmas cards a few years later from our holiday card collection that were sent to the Shackletons over the course of several years in the 1920s. And what you can see is that this architecture, this medieval Tudor architecture, has moved in to the Christmas environment. It becomes a language that is repeated over and over, a visual language that's repeated over and over again as it relates to Christmas. When people start thinking about the holidays, they start imagining this style. These, again, the triangles, the half timbering, the exaggerated chimneys, the steep roofs, the asymmetry, all of these very typical Tudor architecture that are now folded into a Tudor Christmas, a Tudor style of Christmas. And there is, as you can see, a huge number of these in our collection. Extrapolate that out. Imagine, the thousands and the hundreds of thousands and millions of these cards that were flowing through the mail, repeating this iconography. This is a theme we'll come back to over and over again, is the idea of repeatability, the idea of volume in this era. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our next category, the golden age of illustration. Periodicals, magazines, classic Saturday Evening Post. This is a 1930 cover by Norman Rockwell. We can see, all of the elements here. You have the classic Tudor arch, the window. I talked about the dramatic window, the leaded glass. You see the feast, the medieval feast on the inside and the knight on the outside. It's a wonderful cover. It's classic Norman Rockwell. It tells a whole story. in just this one image, the cold night on the outside and the warm feast on the inside. But Rockwell was not alone. There's Wyeth, Parrish, Leyendecker, Pyle, even some lesser known names make it into the exhibit. Dean Cornwell, because he's actually a Louisville-born illustrator, and his great ad here for a antacid. Featuring our very Tudor bit of royalty here. Well, all of these illustrators are tapping into this same theme. And I'm going to highlight a few, but I think the one that does it the best and the one that does it in just sort of a jaw-dropping fashion is Leyendecker. I mean, just look at these covers. Just gorgeous. But again, tying the holiday cover. This is a tradition by this point of almost all periodicals. The December cover is a Christmas cover. It is the holiday cover. They call it the number. This is the holiday number. And all of these illustrators are tapping into this idea of mythic England, mythic Merrie Olde England, Ye Olde England, in creating their illustrations. And again, you can look at this one, especially on the left here, and say, well, that's not Tudor, that's Gothic. But again, it didn't matter. It was old. It was that old feel, that old vibe that was what was important. It wasn't that it was historical accuracy or, that it was, exclusively Tudor, or exclusively Gothic, or exclusively Norman. It was the idea of an amalgamation of all of these. And again, you have some illustrators that actually are on the forefront of this, that are actually sort of heralding the coming of this fascination in America with a Merrie Olde England. This cover by Maxfield Parrish is 1899, well before Tudor Revival is really on anyone's radar screen. But of course, he continues, there we go, continues all the way into the Tudor Revival era, in continuing that sort of interpretation. This is a huge time for periodicals. The amount of magazines that are flowing through American mail and American homes is ginormous. That's the technical term. You can quote me on that. Ginormous. So again, all of these covers, all of these illustrations, all of these beautiful works of art coming into American homes every year, repeating these themes over and over again. Now, it's interesting. In the exhibit, we actually have another section that deals with magazine covers and the idea of exclusivity, going back to that idea that Tudor Revival is something for a very elite, very certain group. And these covers from Houghton Garden are examples of shelter magazines. Shelter magazines had a stake, had a interest in making Tudor Revival feel exclusive. And so what has George Brandt done with these? Well, he's given you Tudor. You can see it again and again. But he's put it behind gates, walls, hedges. He's blocked it off from you. He's made it seem like it's only for a certain group. So that feeds into that idea of Tudor Revival as exclusive, as really designed for only those with a certain checklist of qualities. The other magazines couldn't care less. They're interested in selling their magazines and selling their product, and they are happy to put Tudor Revival on every cover and make it open to everybody. And so you have, this is the one that's actually in the exhibit from Etude. Another one just a year later, great Tudor, again, chimneys, presenting a rather curious problem for Santa. But again, just over and over and over again, the repeatability of these wonderful magazine covers. And again, I'm just giving you a sampling. I could spend, hours just presenting slide after slide of these. So, when I talk about the volume, I really mean that I mean that in both uses of the word. There is a huge volume in terms of number, but it's also a volume that's cranking up this messaging, cranking up this iconography, cranking up this importance in American culture as it becomes more and more tied into the holidays. All right, onwards again to department stores. And department stores have, excuse me, a lot of scholarship about them. They're very important. They are entering their golden age in this era. American cities really almost become defined by department stores, and the shopping experience downtown. Louisville's no different. And a lot of focus around Christmas, around the holidays, is centered on, rightfully so, the windows, display windows. I think lots of people in this room can remember going to department stores and looking at the annual display windows, which were magical. And that is rightfully part of a story about Christmas and a story about department stores and retail and the sort of relationship between those. I actually want to look at something different about department stores. And that is that they were the pioneers of the idea of a Santa's village, Santa's workshop, Toyland, Santa's house. All these manifestations of architecture. Department stores build these within their stores, build them within the floors of their palaces of retail, inviting people in, of course, invite children in to meet Santa Claus. And in doing so, establish a template, establish an architectural template of what this must look like. What do they pick? Tudor Revival. You know where I'm going with this. Example after example after example that we looked at from the 20s and 30s of these things tap into these bits of iconography. Yeah, he's creepy. Castles, turrets, the sort of fairy tale versions of Tudor, the windows and the roofs, the steep gabling, again, turrets and towers and windows, all of these elements that department stores use to build these, what are essentially new environments, shopping environments to sell holidays, to sell wares, to sell a shopping experience that becomes traditional, that becomes, something that we expect. And we stop seeing it as innovative and start recognizing it as tradition. They expand on them. They go out onto the streets with Christmas parades and Tudor floats. They go out into shopping bazaars and Tudor styles. And even here, this is actually Toronto, this is Boston, but even here in Kentucky, Paducah, is advertising Christmas as old-fashioned. The native well said, "Ye Olde." This idea of let's have an old-fashioned Christmas. And again, the architecture in the background that emphasizes what that means, what that looks like. And in doing this, they begin to sort of flood homes yet again, with materials, with books, with songbooks, with carol books, with sheet music, with storybooks, things that you took away from your visit to Toyland and your visit to Santa's workshop and Santa's village and Santa's house, and the rest. And so again, this idea of all of this imagery flowing into American homes, each emphasizing over and over again this connection of an architecture and a tradition. Now, there is a great example not that far from here of all of these things coming together. Has anyone been to Santa's Candy Castle in Santa Claus, Indiana? If you have not been, it is worth a trip. It is a truly unique and especially in this context, fascinating bit of architecture, because what they've done is they've taken this idea of where does Santa live? Well, he lives in Santa Claus, Indiana, of course, everyone knows that. And answered the question with a castle. Now, if you actually stop and think about that, that seems weird. Where did it ever say Santa lived in a castle? But in this context, it makes perfect sense. This was built in 1935. You're coming on the tail end of Tudor Revival's, peak, but they are tapping into everything that we've been seeing, the turrets, the half timbering, the idea of a medieval place. And it is built by the Curtis Candy Company out of Chicago. And it is built in the middle of the Great Depression. And it is still a flourishing site dedicated to things that will give you cavities. But it ultimately is another manifestation, very close here, certainly within the purview of Ohio River Valley history of Tudor architecture finding another manifestation as it relates to Christmas. And so we've tried to take all of this in the exhibit with this installation. This, I have to say, is probably where I see most people when they're walking through the exhibit sort of go to. And I see them look at that do not touch sign and go, I want to touch it. Because it's so cool. So this was built by a local designer, just fabricator extraordinaire, Monty Fields, very well known in the theater community, very well known in the museum community. He worked with us here at the Filson to create what essentially is a Tudor version of Santa's Workshop. The idea being that this sort of visual vocabulary would have been totally understood and totally natural to a holiday shopper in the 20s and 30s. And it is absolutely, one of the most exciting and fun parts of the exhibit, in my opinion. So I hope Monty, I know he's not here tonight. I hope he might be on with us in Zoom, but thank you again for what is just a stellar representation of this idea of Tudor architecture and Santa and Christmas all sort of coming together. All right, my eye on time. All right, I think I'm doing good. All right, Christmas seals. There's a little section in the exhibit about Christmas seals. And you can see right away, I think by now I've got your antenna up, like, oh, see it right away. But why Christmas seals? Well, for an exhibit around Louisville, I thought it was important because the Christmas seal campaign was important here. This was an area that had huge tuberculosis issues. In fact, my colleague here at the Filson, Lynn Pohl, has written a fantastic book, little plug here for her Waverly Hills history. And when this Christmas seals campaign started, Louisville definitely took note. They were in on it. They were part of it, for this precise reason of the impact tuberculosis in the area. And you saw from that sampling that, once again, they're tapping into Tudor Revival themes, Merrie Olde England themes. In the exhibit, we focus on the 1931 campaign because that especially, has this great architectural element to it. But what we really can't do in the exhibit that I want to do here is that, again, that idea of a deep dive around this idea of the stagecoach and the old inn. Over and over and over again, you see in holiday images this pairing of stagecoaches and the Ye Olde Inn. You see it in Christmas cards, you see it in posters, you see it, in those booklets. And again, if you stop and think about it, it's kind of a weird theme. What does stagecoaches and what do inns have to do with Christmas? But in the minds of people that were trying to create this sort of mythology, again, I said accuracy is not paramount here. This is something that they gravitated to. This is something that they hit upon and repeated over and over again visually. The stagecoach part, they explained because, well, they must have had stagecoaches in Merrie Olde England as you can see in these news clippings where, people talked about in Merrie Olde England, they had bundles of evergreens and Christmas season of the old stagecoach and tavern danes. So they've made the leap for themselves. I don't see footnotes. I don't see the research behind this, but it worked for them. The inn, on the other hand, is much more tangible. All throughout the 20s and 30s, hotels and inns get built all across the nation from coast to coast in a Tudor style. And so the idea of traveling for the holidays, going home for the holidays, begins to take on a tangible Tudor bent because you can spend those holidays, or at least on the way to and from, in a merry old Tudor inn, many of which are literally named Ye Olde. Interestingly enough, it's the hotel aspect that actually hangs on. Much later, actually not much later, but a couple decades later, the idea of the Holiday Inn, the Christmas Inn, White Christmas Inn, and the Old Inn, continues to permeate and continues to sort of be situated in our popular culture. But at least in the 20s and 30s, it gets paired with this mythic stagecoach. And one of my favorite quotes in the exhibit is this one. I'll just give you a second to read it. Why do we live in this half-baked pageant? And that's essentially what the stagecoach and inn motif is. It's a pageant. It's a creation on paper and ink and paper of an idea of Christmas, an idea of what a old-fashioned Christmas, a ye old Christmas, must have been like. All right, last one, silent movies. So there is a section in the exhibit about silent movies. We have a running clip of them. We include this postcard of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. What do you see? Tudor House. And in fact, there is a whole genre of Tudor revival that is actually called storybook Tudor, where the architects and designers actually lean into the idea of an almost, fairy tale-esque home. And that you see very much in here. I am going to take just a teeny tiny detour that's not in the exhibit that deals with this and talk very quickly about the story of Hansel and Gretel. It's not a Christmas story, but it becomes connected to Christmas in part because in the golden age of illustration, you have these wonderful representations of the gingerbread house. But I think more importantly is in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century, Engelbert Humperdinck has an opera of Hansel and Gretel that actually becomes hugely popular. It becomes repeated over and over, and at the Met, opera actually begins to have a holiday tradition, not unlike the Nutcracker Suite for ballet of Hansel and Gretel for the holidays, the Hansel and Gretel opera for the holidays. And so holidays become associated with gingerbread houses. So even though I had said, there's sort of this sort of turning away from German tradition, Hansel and Gretel is an exception because of the Tudor designs of so many of these elements in gingerbread houses that exist to this very day. Over and over again, you see gingerbread houses, you're going to see Tudor styling. All right, so I said that was a little detour. So I want to end my sort of buckets of Tudor culture with a little 2-minute clip from Disney. So this is from his Silly Symphonies. These are the shorts. This one comes out in 1933. Like I said, I'm just going to show you the first not even first full 2 minutes of Night Before Christmas. And I think you know what to look for. But just in case, I'll chime in a couple times.
And all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were
great chimney fire, great Tudor fireplace.
In homes that Satan make us, soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their bed, with visions of Santa Claus riding overhead.
Right, see him? One after the other, after the other, after the other. And then those Tudor roofs are so steep, what happens? Okay, so, all right, we're coming to the end now. So this is where I have to justify why you've been listening to me for the past 45 minutes. What's the point? Who cares? Why are we even talking about this? Well, my point is that I think that the massive amount of all of this in the 20s and 30s lasted. It permeated culture in a way that even as Tudor Revival fell out of style, this as a connection to the holidays, this as a connection to Christmas lasted. And it is with us today. That every year as this world of the holidays gets constructed around us, it is filled with Tudor. And so when I see this 1935 sort of Tudor Fantasia Toyland in San Francisco, I can't help but be reminded of Dr. Seuss's Whoville in the classic How the Grinch Stole Christmas. I can't help but notice that when Lego puts out their version of a holiday village, it is filled with Tudor. I can't help but notice that when Hallmark does their endless varieties of holiday movies, it is Tudor. I can't help but notice that franchises that focus on where Santa must live, what does North Pole look like? The Santa Claus, the Christmas Chronicles, on and on. It's an amalgamation of styles, but at its core, Tudor, 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 Tudor. As we export our Christmas culture around the world, what are the themes that other cultures pick up on? Tudor. And even here in Louisville, our holiday traditions ultimately rooted in Tudor Revival. So I hope that this has been a deeper dive than I was able to do in the exhibit, but I hope what you see is what our ultimate goal with this exhibit, which is Tudor Revival is much broader than just a half timber building on a street, that it's a frame of mind almost that permeates culture in the 20s and 30s in a whole variety of ways. And really breaks down that idea that it's meant for a certain group or a certain style or a certain checklist, and instead is multifaceted and sort of opening and inviting in a way that I think we can truly appreciate in the holidays. So thank you.
Dan, I want to thank you. This was brilliant. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Now we have time for questions, and so there's a mic there for anyone who would like to ask one. And I think we had somebody up here. Oh, and there's a mic over here as well. Don't be bashful, and to make you more at ease, perhaps I'll ask the first. Have you been out to Udell and seen the castle there? And then the fairy garden with Tudor houses in it?
Have not, but it sounds magical.
Yeah, a 4-year-old friend of mine who's about this high went with me a few weeks ago, and we were just enchanted with it.
Mhm.
And it's the same theme.
Yeah. One thing that the exhibit doesn't get a chance to really go into is, Tudor Revival has its heyday in the 20s and 30s, but there's echoes of it that continue. It falls out of favor, by the time, the great subdivisions that we think of in the 1950s, Tudor's really, not that considered that often. But there's echoes that repeat. And so, when the bicentennial rolls around, there's all kinds of revivals, and Tudor Revival gets another, 70s version of this sort of Tudor Revival. When the exhibit opened, I had someone ask me, did you think about Renaissance fairs? I was like, oh, I hadn't really, but of course, that idea of a mythic, hodgepodge of a little bit of Renaissance and a little bit of medieval, and sort of mash it all together with a smoked turkey stick that you can walk around with. Absolutely is in keeping with that. So over and over again, we'll see. And I think we'll continue to see manifestations.
Have you taken your study outside of the Louisville area and gone into the rest of the state? For example, I grew up in Hopkinsville. There are all sorts of Tudor houses around. In Ashland, there was a Tudor restaurant called the Chimney Corner. And so it's not just Louisville, it's all over this place.
No, absolutely. One of the things that we wanted to do is use Louisville as a microcosm and sort of take the examples here as representative, because this really truly was a national phenomenon, coast to coast, New York and New Jersey suburbs, all the way to Los Angeles and every place in between. This really was a national, and you couldn't have these magazines and Christmas card companies, putting out this much stuff if it wasn't national. This truly, permeated, the whole culture. But I will say, I loved using Louisville as that case study, because ours is really cool. I mean, as you drive around, and what's funny is working on this exhibit of the past 2 years, you see it more and more. I hope after tonight, as you drive around doing, on routes that you've been in 100 times, oh, I never noticed that's a Tudor, and that's a Tudor, and that's a Tudor. You'll see it more and more.
There are houses now being built, and houses over the last, say, 20 years by developers that use different materials, steep roof lines, stucco, brick, stone. Are we returning in any way to a Tudor revival in those houses?
Yeah, I think so. I think this has staying power. There is a part of the exhibit that talks about the work that goes into renovation and restoring some of the 20s and 30s Tudors. But people do that. People put their love and their heart and their treasure into those renovations because it's a wonderful style to live in. It's a wonderful environment to live in. And if you are building new, why not? Why not tap into these elements that are still there and can still be incorporated? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I live here in the neighborhood, just a few blocks down, a block away from Manual. And of course, Manual is not Tudor, it's Gothic looking, but I'm wondering if there are other public buildings like that. What were those decisions that were made to build in that architectural style? What were they trying to say with Manual? It's an impressive building.
Yeah.
Talk about public building.
Yes. So actually there is another school in the exhibit another high school, in fact, Shawnee High School. And the number of people that have gone up to that section of the exhibit, Shawnee, what's it doing here? And then they look closer, and we were so fortunate to work with the Jefferson County schools that actually have the original architectural drawings, and we were actually to pull out details of that building. It's a castle. It is a beautiful Tudor castle, Tudor arches, it's turrets, it's, stained glass windows. It is a marvelous Tudor building, and it's a school. It was built as a girls' school in its very first iteration. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's, the idea of, hearkening back to learned Old England, as well as Merrie Olde England, the land of Oxford and Cambridge, and, studious monks in their abbeys, scribbling away in scriptoriums. All of that's being evoked in a country that doesn't have, 1,000 years of history, but still wants to make its claims of, one of the finest education systems in the world. And one way to do that is through architecture. And the other thing I'll say about that is, yes, Manuel is definitely more Gothic. Shawnee is definitely more Tudor, but it's all part of the same flow. It's all part of the same river that's sort of, busting through its banks across Louisville and the rest of the country. And again, one of the things I was struck by is, other than, very erudite scholars and architects that, really were drilling down, most people didn't make those distinctions. They just called it's an old English style. It's an old world style. And, I know that there's, enthusiasts who get very down in the weeds about, well, does this make it this particular style of Tudor or that particular style of Tudor? And, one of the things that I hope the exhibit brings out is, it's okay to lump it all together, at least for our purposes.
Your lecture was amazing. You really
you.
brought it to life.
Thanks.
To me, it's a style of architecture that when you look at it, you just feel an immersion of comfort and joy. But I do have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you live in a Tudor house?
So the example I showed you of the building that I used to illustrate what Tudor Revival is, the different elements, is Tudor Terrace. And I live in Unit A. Of Tudor Terrace. So, and it truly is, evocative. It truly is transportive to live in a Tudor. So it's a privilege, for sure. Yes. Go ahead and ask your question. I'll just repeat it for those that won't be able to hear you. Mm-hmm. It would, yes. So the question for those is the picture and the image here is Corsair Children's Hospital, originally called the Cripples Children's Home Hospital. It was always built as a hospital. It was built to this. It was never a home first. It was actually built to spec and actually had its grand opening. I want to say 28, again, this style was chosen for that. Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. Really exciting. It brings a lot of things together that we take for granted. And there's one thing that's missing though. I was looking at the public buildings. And then I was thinking about a place in Indianapolis that I found really attractive in the north side of Merrie that has a wonderful, I guess you call it, Tudor or Gothic church.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is missing.
Well, it's missing here. It's not missing from the exhibit. The exhibit has many public buildings. Shawnee High School is in there. There's a fabulous retail space on Broadway that was the Lemon Silver Gallery. on Broadway, that's in there. So we definitely do highlight public as well as private buildings in the exhibit. It's just with this sort of deep dive into Christmas, I wanted to, put the focus where I couldn't on the walls.
There are Gothic revival churches and all over Louisville, and the old Presbyterian Seminary, which is now, I think, part of the UK or the JCC, yeah, is a lovely example of that. A question that has arisen is this. You have various architectural revival movements. So we had the colonial revival, and then we had the Tudor revival, and then maybe during the 80s, arguably for a while, we had almost an Art Deco revival with the Humana Tower, for example. What is this emphasis in architecture and perhaps American architecture in particular on revivals?
There are whole dissertations written on why we have revivals. I think they serve a lot of purposes. I think classic revival, harkening back to Greek and Roman, gets used in civic buildings, and that communicates a very sort of specific purpose to those buildings. Art museums tap into revivalist architecture to communicate, a history of Western art that's often inside the walls. And so on, colonial revival, is a chance to show a little bit of patriotism and our heritage, which is why I had a resurgence during the bicentennial, as I mentioned, Tudor revival. So, I think these serve purposes that are often, thought about and are decidedly conscious and deliberate on the part of architects and designers when they're being designed. But ultimately, it's people that decide what they mean. An artist can produce an art, the architect can produce a building, but ultimately it's us that decide what we take away from it. I think that's one of the things that we try to emphasize in this exhibit with Tudor Revival is there were a group that wanted to say what Tudor Revival meant. What does it mean to have this Anglo-Saxon throwback? But a lot of people didn't listen, and I think rightfully so. So I think there's lots of reasons that there's revivals, but I think the meaning often changes and depends on who you ask.
And I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience. This really is as fun a presentation as we put on this entire year. Thank you.